In mid-August 1967, two rangers, Leonard Linda and Bert Gildart, set out to a ranger station near Trout Lake in Glacier National Park. They were armed with rifles and given one simple mission: kill any bear on sight. These rangers had a long couple of days leading up to this, both playing a key role in the Night of the Grizzlies. In this video, we're going to go over what exactly occurred during the Night of the Grizzlies, the two young ladies that lost their life, and the reason why 4 bears had to get put down and all of National Park's bear regulations had to be changed. This story is said to be a 1 in a trillion chance of occurring and is a key part of Montana history and National Parks history. I have over 10 pages on Google Docs of notes and probably about the same in this notebook I have right here. I will also be busting out a whiteboard that will show off 2 timelines because this doesn't just involve one bear attack, it involves multiple. I will be leaving all of the sources in the description so you guys can see personal interviews, a PBS documentary, and as well as a podcast that I listen to take all these notes. I hope that this will be a definitive and educational version of the Night of the Grizzlies that you guys can enjoy and learn from. If this is your first time on the channel, this is Montana After Midnight, where we go over a lot of the more mysterious incidents that happened in Montana. My most recent video was on the Garnet Ghost Town, which was an old mining town that now is completely abandoned with plenty of buildings still standing. I actually went on site, recorded, and filmed a whole video there that I'm really proud of. You guys should check out after this. If you enjoy this video, make sure to like and subscribe. While this is mainly for entertainment and informational purposes, I love looking into the history of Montana, and that has been my favorite part of this channel, so make sure to leave some comments on things I should cover in the future. Now that that's all out of the way, let's finally get into the Night of the Grizzlies. Before we go over exactly what happened on August 11th, aka the Night of the Grizzlies, I'm going to use this whiteboard to show you the events that led up to them, as well as a map of where these events took place. This whiteboard gives a basic outline of West Glacier National Park. That side of the park I'm actually very familiar with because I lived in Big Fork, Montana, which is about an hour outside of West Glacier. There's 2 key areas that are very important to this story, one being Trout Lake, the other being Granite Park Chalet. These are the 2 locations where bear attacks occurred on August 12th, 1967. In between these 2 is 8 miles and Heaven's Peak. This is an important fact because it proves that it could not be one bear in the same night. It had to be 2 separate bears attacking 2 separate groups of people. Some other important things I want to point out about this map and the area of West Glacier that really stick out to me is that Avalanche Lake is actually pretty close. Avalanche Lake, if you've never been to Glacier, is probably the most popular hike to do in the summertime. I've done it like 4 times, each with a different group of people, all because they've never done it and they want to do an easy hike. It's honestly a lot of fun, and it's right there. It's crazy to look at a historical map of these incidents, and then boom, here's a hike that I've actually done. The Highline Trail is on the way to the Granite Park Chalet, and the hikers took the Highline Trail, which is crazy because I know so many people that have been on the Highline Trail, and it's super popular, and it starts at Logan's Pass, which is right here, which is where some of our hikers decided to start off their journey as well. Another landmark I want to point out is Lake McDonald, which you're going to be driving past in Glacier if you enter through the west side, where some of our hikers actually were working over the summer. Since we're here and I have this map of the West Side Glacier and the 2 key points pinpointed, I think now would be a good time to talk about each of those locations. If you look at Trout Lake, this is actually a cesspool of bear activity at the time. Bears were constantly being seen there and were well known. Factors that led to heavy bear activity were that it was a long hike pretty far out there was plenty of fish in the water, as well as berries surrounding the lake. If you didn't know, bears are omnivores, meaning that they will eat meat and they will also eat plants, so berries are very attractive towards bears. Naturally, Trout Lake was just a honeypot for bear activity. It also didn't help that back in the day, there was no pack in, pack out rules, so people would leave a lot of trash at Trout Lake, and that'll come into the story much later. If we look at Granite Park Chalet, speaking of trash being left out, there was actually only one incinerator for the entire chalet, a chalet that would hold up to like 65 people. So a ton of trash was being dumped outside the chalet constantly every night. So much so that it almost became a ritual where bears would feed on the trash and guests would look on in awe of the bears right outside the chalet eating the trash that was supposed to be burnt in an incinerator, and it simply wasn't. Of course, today this information is absolutely ludicrous. You're probably wondering, how the heck did we not have pack in, pack out rules? And the answer is, this story kind of created a lot of those rules. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Let's talk about known bear activity at these two locations before the incident of August 12th. Trout Lake, cesspool of bear activity, there was one known problem bear. This bear I'm going to be referred to as the Raggedy Bear. I'm going to refer to it as this because it is an old sow that was known for being, well, raggedy and super skinny / malnourished. If you know anything about bears or wild animals in general, that made this bear extra risky. There's also specific stories of this bear harassing other groups, including Girl Scouts who took a picture of the bear, which ended up in the Kalispell newspaper. It's also famous for harassing Kelly's Camp, which was an outpost really close to Trout Lake. This bear was notorious for going through trash and was not scared of people, which is the most dangerous thing a wild animal can be. You want animals to kind of fear people, basically to run off at the sight of you. If we look at Granite Park Chalet, there was a couple of recurring characters, one dominant, really big, silver-tipped grizzly bear, and then a smaller bear that would follow it around, basically eating its scraps, and then a sow bear, a healthy mother, with 2 cubs. Those 4 bears were the most prominent of the Granite Park Chalet. While Lake Trout had a whole bunch of bears, the Raggedy Bear was the only problem or bear of interest. Now that we've gotten all the setup out of the way, I think I'm going to go into the specific events and actual people affected by the night of the Grizzlies. There is 2 stories to be told here, while they intertwine very strongly, and in fact start at a very similar point. There is 2 timelines going on, so I think to combat this for simplicity, I'm going to have 2 hats. Alright, if I'm talking about one group, aka the Garnet Chalet group, I'll be wearing this hat. And if I'm talking about the Trout Lake group, I'll be wearing this hat. Hopefully this visual cue will help you out, but I'm also going to try to keep it pretty easy to understand. Like I just alluded to just a second ago, these 2 stories actually start in a very similar spot. After watching the PBS special that they tied into the University of Montana, which is where I go to school, and what this project kind of started from, a class at UM, I found out that all the characters at least somewhat knew each other. The first pair of people that we're going to be following are Roy Ducat and Julie Helgensen, and they worked at Glacier National Park over the summer, which involved doing a lot of adventurous things like going on hikes and overnight camping trips. The other group that we're going to be following involves 5 people and an illegal dog, and I'll explain why the dog was illegal later. The second group of people who also worked at Glacier National Park over the summer were Roy and Ron Nozick, Michelle Coons, Paul Dunn, and Denise Huckle. Now, when doing research, it seemed like a crazy coincidence that all of these characters were young people that worked at Glacier National Park over the summer, but while watching the PBS documentary, it seemed like Paul Dunn especially, but probably all of these characters knew each other. Paul Dunn was invited to hang out with Roy and Julie for their camping trip, which was kind of a sad little note because no matter what group he went with that night, it seemed like he was destined to run into a bear. It also seemed like Roy and Julie were invited to go to Trout Lake with the group of 5 other seasonal workers and their dog, but opted out because they've already been to Trout Lake a week prior. The way it really happened in real life, Paul Dunn decided to go with the group of 4 other co-workers that worked at Glacier National Park. Roy and Julie set off on their own adventure at the Granite Park Chalet.
Roy and Julie's story starts at Logan Pass, where they hopped on the Highline Trail and did an 8-mile hike up to the Granite Park Chalet. On the hike, they ran into a whole bunch of other hikers where they told their story and their plans for the night, which was to sleep outside underneath the stars. Some of the hikers actually warned them against doing this due to the crazy bear activity that is seen at the chalet itself. Also, finding out about the habit of dumping all the trash for the bears to go through that was occurring at the chalet, they felt much more comfortable just sleeping inside. However, it was overbooked by a lot. People were sleeping on the floor and there was just no space for them to actually get in. After finding this out, Roy was pointed in a direction of a campsite that was being developed that was said to be in the opposite direction of all the trash dumping. And Roy and Julie felt comfortable enough hearing that it was in the opposite direction of the trash dumping site that they would actually sleep there for the night. Also, they weren't going to be alone in this campsite. They were going to be accompanied by Robert and Janet Klein, as well as Don Gullett. These three had been traveling together for a little while and felt comfortable enough to hang out together while not knowing each other prior to this camping experience, and they also commented about how friendly and outgoing both Roy and Julie were when they met them on their hike, and that they were happy to be staying in the campsite with them. Just taking a step back and looking at this situation, back in the day, people weren't actually afraid of bears, and since the park was made, there hadn't been a grizzly bear attack, so people were a lot less cautious about it. But the idea of having a campsite right next to a trash dumping site that people use to basically lure in the bears for entertainment, because people at the chalet would go out every night and watch the bears as they pick through the trash, is absolutely ludicrous. You don't want to be anywhere near a bear because that thing has the ability to take you out faster than you can blink. Back in the day, there was basically no safety precautions, and all the tips for dealing with bears were basically make noise and play dead. Two tips that are still kind of floating around today, but having that as your only defense is kind of wild. You can 100% see why Roy and Julie wanted to stay in the chalet, and it kind of sucks that they would have to hike 8 miles out of their camping spot later in the day because the chalet was full, so they decided just to camp. And it was nice that they found people that they could camp near at the same time to kind of give them a little bit of comfort. Personally, I would be tweaking and freaking out. Some more context about the chalet that specific night. Joan Devereaux was in charge, and it was actually her first time ever leading a group to the chalet, mainly because the rangers were so short-staffed due to the fire season that was currently happening at Glacier National Park. Other than the ranger and the people that were camping outside with them, there was a couple other key people that were staying at the chalet, mainly a set of 3 doctors, a nurse, and a priest. And these people would have to put their talents to use, unfortunately, as the events of the night occurred. Let's cross over Heaven's Peak and look at the 5 national park workers that decided to camp at Trout Lake. Those workers include Ray and Ron Nozick, Paul Dunn, Michelle Coons, and Denise Huckle. And of course, their dog, Squirt, who wasn't supposed to be there, as you're not supposed to go overnight camping with a dog in Glacier National Park. As mentioned a little bit earlier, there is somewhat of a connection between this group of people and Roy and Julie, who are staying at the chalet. They all work in the park together, and it seems like especially Paul Dunn knew Roy and Julie, and even Roy and Julie might have been invited on this camping trip to Trout Lake. As our group of 5 young park employees made their way towards Trout Lake, they ran into a couple different groups of people. One important group was these 2 fishermen that warned them of the bear activity at the lake that was so aggressive that day that they ended up actually being treed by a specific bear. Being treed meaning basically chased up a tree for safety to get away from the bear. The group was relatively unfazed and kept on their hiking journey, still planning on camping at Trout Lake. One thing about the Trout Lake story in particular is being treed by a bear comes up quite a bit, and it's so scary to me because a lot of people get away from their situation by climbing up a tree like these 2 fishermen. But bears can pretty reliably climb trees, from what I understand. So it's almost like that's not even safe. So if someone's telling me that they were chased up a tree by a bear, I'm like twice as nervous now, because if my only option is to climb a tree, I might climb a tree just to get chased by a bear in the tree. And then what do I do? The group made it to Trout Lake at about 5 p.m. and immediately made a base camp and started fishing. After doing a whole bunch of fishing, they ran into their first bear. This bear ran through their entire camp, tearing it all up and eating up the majority of their snacks and rations that they had brought for the camping trip. Everyone was safe at this point. I believe they ran off, climbed some trees, got to safety, and watched the bear from a distance. Eventually, the bear did end up leaving the camp, and the campers were able to go back, grab the supplies that were still left, including their sleeping bags and a few snacks that the bear didn't get into, and made a new camp a couple hundred yards away from their original camp, feeling safe and dedicated to making one huge fire to keep them safe throughout the night. At around 2:30 in the morning, Denise wakes up hearing the bear rummage through their old camp. The bear is back, looking for more food. Denise at the time is actually cuddling with her dog Squirt, trying to keep it safe because she knows the bear activity is pretty crazy in this area, and the dog isn't supposed to be there in the first place. I'm guessing the dog would be gobbled up if it was let on the loose. She promptly let the whole group know that the bear was still around, still messing around with their old camp, not quite close to their new camp where they're all sleeping, but she made them make the fire bigger, as well as move the food that they still had left over farther away from camp so the bear would hopefully leave them alone. Everyone seemed to be a little bit more anxious now, and they were dedicated to keep the fire going and big throughout the night. Alright, now let's get back to Roy and Julie. While everyone in the chalet was getting ready for bed, sleeping in their bunks, or sleeping on the floor because of how overrun it was, Roy and Julie were sleeping outside, about 100 yards away from Robert and Janet, as well as Don, the other campers, sleeping near them. It's important to say that our characters are not sleeping in a tent or anything that would protect them from the outside. They are literally just cowboy camping, looking up at the stars. Now, as the story goes, around midnight, Roy is woken up by Julie telling him to play dead. After hearing Julie tell him to play dead, he stayed completely silent, only for a grizzly bear to come up to him and rip and throw him out of his sleeping bag. As he's being mauled by the bear, he's thinking of only one thing, and that is to be dead, be completely silent. The bear would then go back and forth between him and Julie eventually making noise, and the bear carrying her off about 100 yards away. While Roy was able to stay completely silent during the encounter, Julie would be heard yelling, saying, "Someone please help us, it's got me," things of that nature, and the bear actually drug her about 100 yards away down the hill where Roy no longer could see her. After the attack and Julie was dragged away, Roy got up and started moving around the campsite, trying to get closer to the chalet so he could ask for help, realizing that he was pretty badly injured from the bear attack, mainly in his arm. As he was moving around the campsite, he ran into Don Gullett's sleeping bag. Don wrapped Roy up in his sleeping bag as Robert and Janet started yelling at the chalet, signaling with a flashlight and SOS symbol, hoping that people would see this at the chalet and then they could end up helping out the campers who were basically in the dark, not knowing if the bear was still around and not knowing if Julie was still alive. Eventually, the people at the chalet were able to see the SOS and started yelling down to Rob, Janet, and Don, asking what the heck was going on, and Rob was able to yell back, "Bear." From there, a whole bunch of things were set in motion. One, a party of people wanted to go down and actually help out Roy and the people at the campsite, and of course find Julie. Meanwhile, the ranger in charge, Joan Devereaux, started radioing HQ, trying to get medical supplies, rangers, rifles, anything they could use to help the situation after hearing of this bear attack. Anxious guests at the chalet were able to meet them down the hill near the campsite, where they actually bought a bed spring, which they put Roy on to carry him up to the chalet. The doctor that helped him at the campsite was Dr. Oldgear Linden, while another doctor looked over him once he actually got to the chalet, where they set up a base camp, cleared off a table, and were able to do some basic first aid on Roy. The entire time they were trying to help out Roy, he was begging them to go after Julie, to the point where people were getting emotional, and it seemed like the mission was to save this 19-year-old girl from the bear that got her. However, the ranger on duty didn't want people splitting up, moving around in the night when there was a bear on the loose. Things got intense, and while people really wanted to go look for Julie, they decided it was better to take care of Roy, focus on that, and wait for reinforcements to come. While the ranger was radioing HQ, it was only able to go through because Bert Gildart was in the area, able to receive the radio from the chalet and actually relay that to HQ. Without him being there, without Bert Gildart being able to receive both radio transmissions, the signal was not clear enough and they were too far away. So it was very lucky that Bert Gildart was there. While they were able to radio for supplies, it wasn't going to be a simple task to actually get them to the chalet. It was pitch black and it was going to be a risky helicopter flight over. Luckily, helicopter pilot John Westover was ready for this mission. Here we are back at the whiteboard, and I'm going to quickly set the scene of the night with Roy and Julie's situation. Here in the middle is the chalet. This is where everyone is staying for the night. If you go this way from the chalet, you'll see the bears and the trash. This is where we're told that they were dumping the trash and where the heavy bear activity was. In the opposite direction of the bears and the trash, there was a campsite in development where they stayed with Janet, Robert, and Don. In the middle of the night, Roy wakes up to Julie telling him to play dead because there's a bear next to them going through their camp. This is when Roy gets attacked. Julie then makes a noise, is subsequently attacked, and eventually dragged away. She's dragged far from the chalet, further down the hill, off of the whiteboard. I'm sorry, it's off the whiteboard, nothing I can do. From there, Roy gets up, starts walking towards the chalet for help to help him recover Julie, and he's also severely injured, and he runs into Don. From there, Don wraps Roy in his sleeping bag, and Robert starts yelling and flashing an SOS up to the chalet, which eventually reaches them. Head Ranger starts radioing base for help, a helicopter and medical supplies, rangers and rifles, anything they have that can help their bear situation. At the same time, 14 ambitious guests staying at the chalet go down the hill carrying a pot of fire, literal fire, to ward off the bear and help out the situation of Roy and Julie. They carry Roy all the way up to the chalet where they're able to give him medical attention. The group is very riled up, wanting to go save Julie, especially since Roy is literally crying out, "Hey, go save Julie, forget about me, save Julie." However, the ranger in charge says we need to wait, we need to be safe and smart and wait for reinforcements to come. One question I have with this series of events that came up is that in all of the research that I've done, it said that the trash was supposed to be dumped over here. The campsite is supposed to be the opposite direction over here. But it's always something that's just alleged. It's never said fully strongly with your chest, the trash is over here, the campsite's over here. Instead, it says the trash is supposed to be over here. The campsite's supposed to be in the opposite direction, which kind of adds doubt. Is the trash and the campsite actually closer together than it was originally supposed to be? I don't know, that's just a question that I have, especially knowing that there's a bear attack. Once the radio goes through and the helicopter is on the way, like I mentioned earlier, it is pitch black. They cannot see anything, and the guests actually light a ring of fire for the helicopter to safely land on. They were giving some ground assistance, which was crazy with the use of fire, and people were shining flashlights in the sky to get the helicopter's attention. Once again, John Westover had to be a complete badass in this situation because you can barely see, and he luckily did a similar trip in the same area a couple days before, so he was used to it, but flying at night was still not an easy feat. Actually, almost humorously, people shining flashlights into the helicopter was throwing everything off. They couldn't see, they were being blinded by the flashlights, so they had to radio back to the chalet to tell people, hey, shine the flashlights on the ground so we can see where we're landing. Don't shine them in our eyes where we can't see anything at that point. With the helicopter landing, they were able to drop off a whole bunch of medical supplies, as well as Ranger Gary Bundy, who was able to lead an expedition to hopefully find Julie. With the helicopter landing, they decided to actually airlift Roy Ducat out of there due to all of his injuries. Back over at Trout Lake, our group of 5 park employees and the dog Squirt were sound asleep. At 4:30 in the morning, Paul Dunn woke up to the sound and smell of a grizzly bear's slow breath as it lingered over him. The bear had gotten into their new camp and was checking him out. In the documentary, there was an interview with him where he talked about how disgusting the bear's breath smelled and how imposing it was to have it so close to him. Paul luckily was sleeping with his sleeping bag half zipped open, claiming that earlier in the night he was too lazy to zip it all the way up after they moved camp. Because of this, when the bear bit down on his sleeping bag, catching onto his sweatshirt, he was able to weasel out and get far away from the bear's grasp, jumping over the fire up into a tree. During the commotion of Paul being attacked by the bear, Denise, who was holding on to Squirt in her sleeping bag, was told by Ron to get the heck out of there. The only issue was Squirt, while in her sleeping bag, was still tied down because she didn't want the dog running off, so it was a little bit of a hassle, a stressful event to get the dog unhooked so they could get out of there. The bear, while it was angered by Paul, was now on to them. They were able to run and get up a tree far away and safe from the bear. At this point, Paul Dunn, Ron, and Denise are all to safety, including their dog Squirt. All those 3 are out of harm's way, and they're yelling at the 2 people left, being Ray and Michelle, to get the heck out of there. This is an extra tidbit about the story and just everything as a whole that I want to talk about, because I don't think it was talked about in the podcast or the documentary or other sources that I looked up, but it is a connection that kind of explains what happens next in this story. If you look back to Julie and Roy's story, they were both told to play dead. That's actually just what you're told to do in the face of a grizzly bear, especially back in the time. So when Ray and Michelle are the only 2 left in camp, Ray decides to run and is able to get to safety, while Michelle doesn't do anything. She stays in the camp. And every source that I looked up for this, it just says that he ran, all the other people ran earlier, and Michelle was just left in her sleeping bag doing nothing. And it was a little confusing. It was missing a little bit of context, like why is Michelle just slower than everyone else? Like why was she left? And I think part of it is probably like she was in shock, and then another part is everyone is always just told to play dead, so in that moment she might have just been the only one that said, you know what, I'm gonna play dead. But at this point, everyone is safe up a tree far away from the bear, except for Michelle. The bear bit down on her sleeping bag as she yelled out multiple things, one being that the bear is trying to rip her arm off, and the other, oh my god, I'm dead, which is super chilling and really sad, honestly. And eerily similar to Julie, Michelle was dragged away by the bear, this time over a hill, far away from her friends, as all they can do is listen to the carnage happening right in front of them as they fear for their lives, stuck in a tree. One of the sources that I used while researching the night of the Grizzlies was the National Park After Dark podcast, where I listened to the whole thing and I took notes. And one of the things they said that during this incident, Paul Dunn was actually able to hear the bear crunching down on Michelle Coons' bones, which is extremely disturbing and something you don't really want to think about. This didn't come up in the PBS documentary, and I think what might have happened is the PBS documentary used real interviews off of the people, where the National Park After Dark used the Night of the Grizzlies book, which was written about the events by an outside person, which is said to be very accurate, but of course a book is going to play into things a little bit more to be more entertaining. That's like the purpose of a book. So I don't know if Paul was actually able to hear his friend being mauled by the bear that distinctly, but if he was able to hear his friend being crushed by this bear and mauled by the bear, I think that's incredibly sad and disturbing. The group at the chalet was finally able to start looking for Julie at around 2:30 in the morning. This is about 2 hours after the original attack on her and Roy. The group was made up of doctors, a priest, the ranger that came on the helicopter. Among the people in the group was Steve Pierre, who was actually able to track Julie via the blood and ripped up camp gear that led to a trail in the woods. About 100 yards down the trail, it unfortunately went cold and he couldn't find anything else. Luckily, very faintly, they were able to hear whimpers coming from the woods that ended up being Julie herself. The words that she was crying out, according to the group that was searching for her, was, "It hurts." When they got to Julie, and this is where it gets a little bit gory or gross, the only thing that seemed to be untouched by the bear was her face. Her hair was covered in mud, her lungs were collapsed, and she had bled out so much over the last 2 hours that her wounds were barely bleeding, and she was basically clinging onto life by a thread. Because of the bear attack, most of Julie's clothes had been ripped, so members of the group that went to go rescue her would all give up some clothing to help keep her warm as they tried to get her out of there. Just like Roy, they used a bed spring to carry her up the hill to the chalet, where they were able to more comfortably treat her and see exactly what her condition was at the time. Julie was far from looking good. She had a collapsed lung, wounds all over her, contusions all over her, and like I said earlier, had lost a lot of blood. During their ascent back up the hill trying to save Julie, Robert Klein would hold her hand, trying to give her any human comfort that he could possibly give to her at the time, trying to make sure that she felt safe and secure. At the same time, Tom Connolly, the priest that was accompanying the group, was trying to give her heavenly comfort, talking to her about God, religion, and anything that would help console her during this terrible event as she was in a lot of pain as they carried her up to the chalet. Once the group got all the way back to the chalet, it was all hands on deck with multiple doctors looking at Julie trying to help her. The main doctor, Surgeon John Lubinsky, was doing everything that he could, and his wife, who was also a nurse, was trying to help Julie and make her as comfortable as possible. After assessing all of her wounds and the condition that she was in a moment of silent realization, the surgeon John Lubinsky looked at the priest and shook his head in dismay, as both men realized that Julie Helgensen wasn't going to make it. The priest, Tom Connolly, stayed with Julie for a while, being by her side, trying to comfort her as best as he could. While the priest was comforting her, he was also praying over her, and it seemed like Julie was following along, using basically all the energy she had left to mouth the words of the prayers along with him. Eventually, the priest asked for some water, and he used it to baptize Julie moments before she ended up passing away. Despite the massive effort of one group of people united by trying to save her life, Julie Helgensen passed away on August 13th, 1967 at Glacier National Park due to a grizzly bear attack. While super tragic, I feel like the story of Julie Helgensen and the group at the chalet doing everything they can to save her really is just super inspiring, almost like the indomitable human spirit became realized. There were so many key people that all played together, trying the best that they can, doing everything to their abilities, using their specific skills to help out this situation. Even Roy Ducat, the other victim, the guy that was mauled by the bear before Julie, was crying out the entire time, telling people to go save Julie. There's literally nothing more inspiring than that statement right there. I think that's what everyone would hope to be after you just got attacked, looking out for others. Then there's even the courageous helicopter pilot John Westover, who was able to come in the middle of the night, do a scary as heck flight all the way to the chalet in pitch black to help save Roy Ducat and bring medical supplies for Julie, and also bring over Gary Bundy, who was the one that allowed the group to go into the night and actually search for Julie. There's also people like Steve Pierre, who was able to use his knowledge to lead the search for Julie, as well as track down where she actually was. There's people like the priest and Robert Klein, who, by all means, Robert Klein was just a normal guy camping right next to them, and he was able to give this dying young woman some comfort in her last couple of minutes. That's just incredible. And then similarly, if we talk about the priest, Tom Connolly, being able to pray over someone, an innocent person that just had a tragic event happen to them, and give them comfort, even baptize them and deliver some final prayers over them in their last moments. While massively tragic, it is also simultaneously one of the most beautiful stories of people coming together, just trying to do the right thing. And I love that aspect of it. We left the group of people at Trout Lake stuck up trees, scared for their lives, as their friend Michelle Coons was just dragged over a hill by a wild grizzly bear. It is now 8 o'clock in the morning, and the group has made their way to a ranger station where they're hoping they can get help finding their friend Michelle Coons, praying that she is still alive. The ranger that they end up talking to is Leonard Linda, and he is in disbelief and a little bit confused by the situation, because there has never been a bear attack in park's history, except for the bear attack that happened hours before at Granite Park Chalet. This means that there was 2 bear attacks on the same night. Crazy, nearly impossible situation aside, Leonard had sprung to action, taking along with him Paul and Ron as they went to go search for Michelle. Joining them was Ranger Burt Gildart, the same Burt Gildart that helped relay the incident at the chateau hours earlier. It's pretty crazy seeing some of these characters crisscross between both of these bear attacks, as they happen very far apart, but in the same national park. Of course, certain key characters played alongside in both of them. Speaking of which, it's also important to say that John Westover, the same helicopter pilot that helped get Roy Ducat to safety as well as bring medical supplies and a ranger to the chalet, also flew his helicopter and landed near Trout Lake to help with their search. And I just think it's super interesting that there is just this crossover of people that were involved in both cases. The second search party of the night, looking for a 19-year-old girl, set out to Trout Lake. Very quickly, they were able to pick up a trail and start tracing her down. Along the way, it said that they found a particular lump of flesh lying on the ground. And when they picked it up and examined it closer, they found it to be Michelle Coons' ear, which is pretty gross and not a great sign. Only a few feet further, they found Michelle's bloody, torn up sleeping bag. Following the path of destruction, they found ripped up, bloody clothes that belonged to Michelle. Eventually, after following the trail for a little while, Leonard called out, saying that he had found Michelle, her body mutilated and unrecognizable. Burt Gildart's account of the situation as he saw Leonard was that he was clearly in shock and taken back by the whole situation. And Burt speculated that Leonard actually knew of Michelle before the incident, just showing again how interconnected all the employees at the park actually were and familiar they were with each other. And of course, it's traumatizing losing a friend to a situation like this, or even just casually knowing someone that had been attacked in such a gruesome way. Later that morning, Michelle Coons was airlifted far away from Trout Lake and the bear that mauled her to death. Coming full circle, let's talk about the bear hunts that occurred after these tragic deaths of 2 young employees of Glacier National Park. Over near the Granite Park Chalet, hunters set traps hoping to lure in the bear that ended up mauling and killing Julie. Like I said at the very beginning of the video, there were some reoccurring bears that were known to show up at the chalet. One big silver-tipped grizzly that would show up constantly, that was followed by a smaller grizzly that would kind of pick off its scraps. These 2 bears were found eating the bait that was left out for them, and hunters posted up at the chalet shot and killed both bears. After analyzing the bears, they found no evidence of them having anything to do with Roy and Julie's maulings. And when they opened up their stomachs, they found only vegetation and the trash that was left out for them to eat. As days passed, the trash that they had left out for those bears had been completely eaten, meaning that other animals had to come to the same spot and eat up what was left out. including other bears. The hunters then stockpiled a new trap where they came across a sow, a mother bear, and her 2 cubs. They were sure that this bear had to have been responsible for the death of Julie, and subsequently shot that bear as well as one of the cubs in the mouth. You see, as this was the first grizzly bear attack in Glacier National Park, the repercussions were taken to the extreme, and everyone that was hunting down these bears were told to kill any bear on site at those locations. Of course, at the time, we were pretty naive, feeding bears trash, getting super close to them, letting humans and bears interact freely, and then our response to a bear attack was super naive as well, to just kill any bear that was in the area. So the sow bear had to get shot and put down, and one of the cubs was shot, although it was shot in the jaw, and it lived. The rangers that shot the bear were extremely positive that this had to have been the bear that killed Julie and mauled Roy, but when they cut open its stomach, they found that there were no human remains to be found and no evidence that it was actually the bear. There is some back and forth depending on the sources that you use. Some of the sources say that this was most likely the bear that killed Julie. Other sources say that this probably wasn't the bear. There was some blood on the claws, but it wasn't confirmed to be Julie's. And also the bear had a ripped up paw, meaning that it could have been extremely angry and violent during the time that Julie was mauled. Having an upset, injured bear, especially one with cubs, would make it extra violent and more likely to commit a crazy act like mauling a person when they're not really known to do that very often. It's never happened in the park's history, of course. Another sad tragedy that ties into killing this sow bear was that the cub that was shot in the mouth actually survived the winter, which means it was suffering the entire time. Its jaw was shot off, it couldn't eat very well, and it was very malnourished. By some miracle, it did survive though. It was found the next summer and euthanized because it was in pain and honestly wasn't living the best life, when in reality it probably should have never been shot to begin with. The other cub's location is unknown and was presumably unharmed and lived on. So in the case of the bear that attacked Julie and Roy, it is unknown if it was the mother bear of 2 cubs that was shot and killed, or if the bear was never found. Luckily, there is a more solid conclusion to the bear that attacked Michelle Coons. If you remember the beginning of this video, I talk about how 2 rangers were sent out on a mission with one order: kill any bear you see on site. That was the orders given to Bert Gildart and Leonard Linda as they set out to find the bear that killed Michelle Coons. These 2 rangers were tied through this story through and through, as they were the ones to find Michelle Coons' body, and Ranger Gildart worked as a relay man between the chalet and National Park HQ earlier in the case of Roy and Julie's attack. These 2 men set out for Trout Lake, staying at a ranger cabin. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Ranger Gildart went out to go to the bathroom, where he heard a rustling in the woods. This was the raggedy bear that was known to terrorize Kelly's camp as well as Trout Lake. The bear was running in and out of the woods, back and forth, meaning that he was unable to get a shot, but him and Ranger Linda were determined to kill this bear. While they weren't able to get a shot right away, eventually the bear decided to come charging at them. It is at that moment that both of them simultaneously took a shot, putting down the bear for good. Unlike the bears at the chalet, the raggedy bear's autopsy showed that it definitively was the bear that ended up killing Michelle Coons. When they cut up the bear's stomach, they found a lump of blonde hair still digesting, confirming that it was the bear that ended up taking Michelle Coons' life. Just like how the sow bear at the Granite Park Chalet was injured and probably in a lot of pain, making it more violent, the bear at Trout Lake had glass found in its teeth, likely from digging through so much trash that people had left out. The glass constantly putting the bear in pain, making it more feral, more aggressive, and of course, more dangerous. The news at the time was trying to find any reason why these 2 bear attacks, separated by Heaven's Peak, occurred on the same night, after it has been so rare and so uncommon for bears to attack humans. Looking through a modern lens, it's very clear what happened, and it is just pure coincidence that bears attacked on the exact same night. What happened was that humans and bears got too comfortable around each other, making bears more dangerous, as well as the excessive trash found at Glacier National Park, which led bears to creep closer and closer to people as they slept overnight. In the years following this, bear management had been changed forever, and it morphed into what we see nowadays and bear safety that we have in the modern day. Immediately following the attacks, bears were hated and killed and demanded to be pushed out of our parks and country altogether. However, in 1973, grizzly bears were added to the endangered species list and were thought of with more care, finally having a level mindset towards grizzly bears in general. They're not cute and cuddly playthings for people, and they're also not vicious monsters. They're just animals that need their own space and shouldn't commingle with humans. Nowadays, bear population is on the rise and doing well, especially since to the regulations and practices we have nowadays being smarter and safer for both bears and people. And with that, my coverage on the night of the Grizzlies is over. I had an amazing time making this video. It was my most ambitious project yet. My longest video with the most amount of editing. It was a huge effort on my part, and I've never done something this big, so I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'll be leaving a whole bunch of other sources on the night of the Grizzlies for you to check out. There's the podcast from National Park After Dark, which has a whole bunch of other episodes that you guys should check out with other stories that I haven't covered, so it's fresh and new, and it's not in video format, so it's good for a long drive. And then there's also the PBS documentary, which was made in tandem with the University of Montana, which is where I'm going to school and where this project stems, so go Grizz for that one. And the PBS documentary did a great job of hearing from all the people that were actually there. Like, you get witness accounts of the night of the Grizzlies, so that's super cool and useful. Totally different from what I did, but still related to this event, so I highly recommend checking that out. And if you were worried about Roy Ducat, he actually shows up in the documentary, so he did in fact survive his injuries. And finally, I want to very graciously thank you for getting this far into the video. It was a long one. Since you're here, you probably liked what you saw. Make sure to subscribe, check out my website, and I highly recommend checking out my Instagram, where you're going to see behind the scenes stuff, upcoming videos, and it's just another fun way to interact. Anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed. This was Montana After Midnight. Be safe out there.